Can you believe that an empire so vast, so staggeringly huge, that it commanded 45% of the entire known world's population could simply vanish? It didn't just fall, it dissolved into the dust of 1,000 forgotten battlefields, leaving behind only whispering ghosts of gold and blood. This is not just history. This is the chronicle of the only time in human existence when a single ruling dynasty stretched its shadow from the scorching sands of Egypt all the way to the frozen river valleys of India, forging a chain of command that no king, before or since, has ever truly replicated. We're talking about a civilization that gave the world the first concept of human rights, codified law, and standardized currency, and then wielded that immense structural power like a god-slayer's axe, changing the trajectory of every nation it touched. But before the thunder, there was only silence. Before the roaring lions of Persepolis, there were only scattered tribes, huddled in the remote, rugged highlands east of Mesopotamia, living under the heel of an unimaginable terror. Imagine the world around 650 BC. The great Babylonian Empire, brutal and majestic, sat like a bloated, golden spider in the cradle of civilization, demanding tribute and obedience from every minor kingdom. To the north, the Medes, a fiercely effective but deeply arrogant power, ruled with an iron fist, convinced that their dominance was eternal, their walls impenetrable, their armies invincible. They had crushed the Assyrians and now saw themselves as the ultimate apex predator of the ancient Near East. And who were the Persians? They were nobody. A footnote, a forgotten vassal state dwelling in the dusty province of Anshan, paying their heavy taxes, grinding their teeth in frustration, dreaming of a freedom that seemed utterly impossible. They were seen as rough mountain men, simple and easily managed, useful for sending levies to the armies of their Median overlords, but never, ever a threat. This catastrophic miscalculation, this profound arrogance of the established powers, is where the earthquake begins. It is the year 550 BC, and the world is about to be violently ripped apart by a man who started with nothing but a lineage of minor princes and an almost supernatural charisma. His name was Cyrus the Great, and he was the shadow everyone ignored, the ticking clock no one heard. Can you believe the audacity? A small, supposedly loyal prince decides he has had enough of bowing to the tyrant Astyages, the king of the Medes. This wasn't just treason, it was suicide. Astyages controlled the vast majority of the Iranian plateau, commanding a cavalry so famous it was the stuff of legend. Yet Cyrus saw the weakness beneath the gold plating. He saw the rot of complacency. He recognized that immense power, often wielded carelessly for generations, creates its own internal fragility, waiting for the right moment to shatter. The initial revolt was met with laughter in the Median court. Cyrus? That little dog? Send a detachment and bring me his head on a platter. But what they didn't account for was the fire he ignited in the hearts of his people. A desperate, blazing belief that true freedom was worth annihilation. The sheer military genius that unfolded next defies belief. Cyrus didn't just fight the Medes, he dismantled them from the inside out. He used alliances, strategic brilliance, and most importantly, the psychological advantage of being underestimated. The Battle of Pasargadae was not a simple skirmish. It was the moment the world order officially collapsed. The Median army, supposedly the unbreakable spine of the region, faltered, betrayed by their own generals who were tired of Astyages' cruelties. Imagine the scene. The greatest army in the world is suddenly turning its spears inward, collapsing into anarchy. Astyages, watching his eternal dominance crumble in a single bloody afternoon, was captured not as a warrior, but as a bewildered victim of history's cruelest joke. But here is the twist that separates Cyrus from every other barbarian chieftain who tasted power. He didn't execute Astyages. He didn't burn the Median capital to the ground. He integrated the Medes into his own command structure, honoring their nobility and absorbing their strength. This act of revolutionary mercy was the blueprint for the entire Achaemenid Empire. It wasn't built on terror alone. It was built on respect, tolerance, and the shocking promise that if you submitted, you would not only survive, but thrive under his banner. A catastrophe no one saw coming had just played out. In less than 3 years, the little dog from Anshan had eaten the massive master. The balance of power was utterly destroyed, replaced by a nascent empire that was terrifying in its speed and terrifying in its calculated humanity. Now, Cyrus stood alone, staring out from the newly formed Persian plateau, realizing that conquest was only the first step. The Babylonian giant was watching. The legendary King Croesus of Lydia, famed for his unimaginable wealth, was sharpening his knives in the west. The history we're about to plunge into is not just a study of dates and kings. It is the study of how one man, fueled by an almost supernatural ambition, turned a collection of goat herders into the architects of the world's first true superpower, setting a standard for imperial rule that would echo through Rome, Byzantium, and beyond. Get ready, because the age of bronze and iron is over. The age of gold, justice, and absolute terrifying Persian dominance has just begun. Sleep well, because we are starting this story right now, and trust me, you do not want to miss the magnitude of the coming storm. We left off staring into the abyss of history, right at the moment when a forgotten kingdom was about to swallow the known world. This is not a story of slow, planned expansion. This is the tale of a singularity, a catastrophic military genius named Cyrus II, who emerged from the dusty hills of Anshan, a minor, insignificant vassal state under the iron fist of the Median Empire. For generations, the Persians had paid their tribute, bowed their heads, and played the part of the obedient subject, a tiny ripple in the vast ocean of Median power. But deep beneath that compliance, the blood of kings, the Achaemenid line, was boiling, waiting for the spark that would ignite the greatest revolt the ancient Near East had ever seen. The Median king, Astyages, was complacent. He viewed his Persian subjects as loyal dogs, useful for taxes and occasional skirmishes, certainly not as an existential threat. This arrogance was the fatal flaw that Cyrus exploited with surgical precision, beginning not on the battlefield, but in the shadows of the court. The year is approximately 559 BCE, and the Persian storm breaks. Cyrus raises the banner of rebellion, an act that should have been crushed instantly by the overwhelming might of the Median military machine. Yet, The Median army was rotten from the inside out, commanded by officers who were either lazy, corrupt, or secretly admired the electrifying audacity of the young Persian leader. The pivotal moment arrived with the defection of Harpagus, one of Astyages' chief generals. Harpagus, harboring a deep, personal vendetta against the king, a vendetta so horrific we can barely describe it, switched sides, bringing the knowledge, strategy, and a significant portion of the Median forces directly into Cyrus's camp. Cyrus did not destroy it, he absorbed it. He treated Astyages with respect and integrated the Median nobility and military structure into his burgeoning dominion, a political stroke of genius that immediately doubled his strength and garnered him loyalty, not resentment. He became the king of Persia and Media, the first true king of kings of the Iranian peoples, establishing the essential blueprint for the Achaemenid Empire, overwhelming force tempered by unexpected mercy. But holding the Iranian plateau was just the warm-up act. The real test of Cyrus's world-altering ambition lay to the west, where three colossal powers watched his ascent with growing panic: Babylon, Egypt, and the fabulously, unbelievably wealthy kingdom of Lydia. Lydia, ruled by the legendary King Croesus, was literally made of gold. Croesus controlled the western trade routes and the sources of electrum, making his capital, Sardis, the richest city in the world, a place where people actually had too much gold to spend. Croesus, seeing the sudden, violent disappearance of Media, decided he could not wait for Cyrus to knock on his door. He sought counsel from the Oracle of Delphi, asking if he should attack the Persian upstart. The oracle's infamous reply echoed across the ancient world: "If you attack, a great empire will fall." Croesus, blinded by arrogance and his immense wealth, assumed the oracle meant the Persian Empire. He was tragically, monumentally wrong. The clash was inevitable, a collision between the new, brutal efficiency of the Persian military and the pampered, gold-laden armies of Lydia. The first battles were inconclusive, brutal affairs on the Anatolian steppes. Croesus, confident in his capital's impregnability, retreated to Sardis for the winter, assuming Cyrus would do the same. This was his second and final fatal mistake. Cyrus the Great did not respect calendars or seasons. He launched a lightning-fast pursuit, catching the Lydian army completely off guard. Imagine the shock. One moment, you are preparing for a long winter rest behind the impenetrable walls of your golden city. The next, the entire Persian army is outside your gates, ready to strike. Sardis was a natural fortress, protected by sheer cliffs. It was considered impossible to assault directly. But Cyrus was a master of unconventional warfare and psychological terror. He ordered his men to scale the cliffs from the least protected side, the side everyone considered unscalable, under the cover of darkness. The Persians swarmed the walls, achieving the impossible. Croesus was captured. The Lydian Empire, the synonym for wealth and opulence, fell into the hands of a man who cared little for gold, only for territory and strategic control. The moment Cyrus walked through the gates of Sardis, the balance of global power tilted irrevocably. Now, with the vast resources of Media and the unimaginable wealth of Lydia in his treasury, the path to the final showdown, The ultimate prize, the jewel of the Fertile Crescent, Babylon itself, was wide open. The shadow of the King of Kings grew longer, stretching across the sands toward the mighty walls of the last great power standing in his way. Prepare yourself, because the fall of Babylon is not just a conquest. It is a meticulously planned, devastating spectacle of geopolitical genius. You stood before Babylon, and the world held its breath. This wasn't just a city, it was the ultimate fortress, an architectural arrogance designed to spit in the face of every invading army for 1,000 years. Its dual walls, the outer ones stretching miles, and the inner ones so thick that legend claims 2 4-horse chariots could pass abreast on the ramparts, seemed to touch the very clouds. King Nabonidus, though perhaps more interested in archaeology than governance, and his arrogant son Belshazzar, who was definitely interested in hedonism, simply laughed at the approaching Persian storm. They had food stockpiled for 20 years, the mighty Euphrates River cutting straight through the heart of the city, providing unlimited water and an ultimate natural defense. The ultimate, arrogant confidence of human engineering. They believed that if Cyrus tried to besiege them, he would die of old age and frustration before the scent of fear ever reached the kitchens of the Hanging Gardens. They were safe, they were rich, and they were tragically, utterly wrong about the man they were fighting. Because Cyrus the Great was not merely a warrior, he was a hydrologist, a propagandist, and a theatrical genius who understood that brute force fails where precise strategy triumphs. He wasn't going to spend years in a fruitless siege, slowly chipping away at stone with expensive, unreliable siege engines. No, his plan was simple, audacious, and utterly terrifying in its precision. While Nabonidus was away, perhaps praying to the moon god Sin or collecting ancient artifacts, Belshazzar threw a massive, drunken party, the infamous Feast of Belshazzar, the night the gods themselves seemed to have abandoned the Babylonians. As the wine flowed and the music roared within those colossal walls, as Belshazzar famously drank from the sacred golden vessels stolen from the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, the Persian engineers were working silently, miles upstream. They were diverting the entire flow of the mighty Euphrates into a massive, previously prepared canal network, a hidden engineering marvel of its own. The river that was meant to be Babylon's eternal protector suddenly, impossibly, began to vanish. The water level inside the city dropped rapidly, revealing the sticky, muddy riverbed beneath the massive bronze gates that usually secured the water entrance, gates the Babylonians foolishly assumed no one would ever be able to access. The Persian Special Forces, the very first shock troops of the burgeoning global empire, didn't need ladders or siege towers. They walked right in, marching up the former riverbed, finding their way through the massive sewer outlets and water channels that had suddenly been exposed to the open air. Inside, the guards were drunk, complacent, convinced that no enemy could ever breach the river defense, and the populace was celebrating, oblivious to the geological disaster unfolding outside. The first sign of trouble wasn't a crashing wall. It was a silent, lethal whisper of Persian steel in the dark streets, a horrifying realization that the river had turned traitor. Belshazzar, according to the terrifying accounts, was struck down that very night, his body left among the remnants of his sacrilegious feast, the very symbol of Babylon's sudden, spectacular collapse. When Cyrus finally rode into the city, there was no widespread bloodshed, no mass slaughter of the kind that the Assyrians had perfected, at least not initially. He presented himself not as a destructive conqueror, but as a restorer, a savior sent by Marduk, the chief Babylonian god, whom the Nabonidus had apparently offended through his religious reforms. This political move was perhaps his greatest weapon, turning fear into gratitude overnight. He immediately issued the most famous document of the ancient world, the Cyrus Cylinder. This clay barrel, inscribed in cuneiform, laid out his policies: respect for local customs, honoring local gods, prohibiting the destruction of homes, and, perhaps most famously, the Edict of Return. Suddenly, thousands of people, the exiled Jews who had been captive in Babylon for decades, were free to go home, to rebuild Jerusalem, to worship their own God without fear of reprisal. This wasn't merely mercy. This was geopolitical masterstroke, establishing Cyrus as a beacon of tolerance, guaranteeing loyalty across vast, diverse territories. With the collapse of Babylon, Cyrus now ruled over an empire stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, controlling roughly 45% of the entire human population. Think about that number. Nearly half of all people on Earth suddenly answered to one man in Persia, a scale of power absolutely unprecedented in human history. But, unlike the brutal, fear-based Assyrian Empire before him, Cyrus realized that you couldn't rule that much diversity solely through terror and constant warfare. He laid the foundation for the most sophisticated administrative machine the world had ever seen, creating the early framework of what would become the satrapy system. These were massive provinces, each governed by a satrap, or protector of the kingdom. It was a decentralized approach, allowing local elites to retain power, provided they paid their taxes, sent their levies, and acknowledged the absolute supremacy of the King of Kings. But even the greatest king cannot escape destiny. Cyrus the Great, the man who started as a minor prince and ended as the master of the world, never stopped expanding, driven by an insatiable hunger for the horizon. His final campaign took him far to the east, into the unforgiving steppes against the fierce nomadic Masagatai tribes, led by the legendary warrior queen Tamaris. The architect of the Achaemenid dream was gone, leaving his vast, sprawling creation to his son, Cambyses II, a man whose ambition matched his father's, but whose sanity was about to be tested against the burning sands of the next great prize, the ancient, magnificent, and fiercely guarded land of Egypt. Cyrus the Great had forged the impossible empire out of fire and sheer will, but the monumental task of holding it fell to his son, Cambyses II, a man whose ambition matched his father's, but whose sanity was about to be tested against the burning sands of the next great prize, the ancient, magnificent, and fiercely guarded land of Egypt. Cambyses looked at Egypt not merely as a conquest, but as the final, necessary validation of the Achaemenid supremacy, the last true rival to the title of universal empire, and he set his gaze upon the Nile with a terrifying intensity that brooked no failure. This was not a quick skirmish against a fledgling kingdom. This was a war against 4,000 years of documented, glorious history, a land guarded by impenetrable deserts, powerful naval alliances, and a populace that believed their pharaohs were living gods. The pharaoh ruling this colossal land was Amasis II, an old, cunning fox who thought his deserts and his formidable navy made him untouchable, relying heavily on his Greek mercenary commander, Phanes of Halicarnassus, to secure the western borders. But Cambyses had learned the most terrifying lesson from his father's legacy. Loyalty is a weakness that can always be bought or broken. And the Egyptian defenses crumbled not from external assault, but from a catastrophic internal betrayal that opened the gates of the ancient world. Phanes, knowing the secrets, the supply lines, and the very weaknesses of the Egyptian defense, fled to the Persian court, whispering the fatal blueprint for invasion into the ear of the great king, ensuring that the assault would be surgical and entirely unexpected. With the powerful Phoenician fleet, now vassals of the Achaemenids, providing naval supremacy and Phanes guiding the land forces, the stage was set for the collision of the New World Order and the colossal Old Guard. And the definitive battleground would be the desolate, forgotten sands near the fortress of Pelusium. Imagine the scene, 525 BCE. The Persian war machine, a composite of every nation Cyrus had devoured, met the desperate, proud forces of the Saite dynasty, and the air was thick not just with dust, but with the suffocating weight of history about to be pulverized. The Egyptians fought with a spiritual ferocity unmatched in the world, believing their patron gods protected the Nile. But Cambyses had a psychological weapon ready, a stroke of genius, or perhaps absolute calculated madness that instantly crippled the Egyptian fighting spirit where steel could not. Legend, and you know the greatest stories are always drenched in legend, states that Cambyses ordered his frontline soldiers to carry sacred Egyptian animals, cats, dogs, and ibis birds, creatures revered as living manifestations of the gods Bastek, Anubis, and Thoth. The Egyptian soldiers, paralyzed by religious terror, stood frozen, unable to loose their arrows or swing their blades, terrified of killing a deity in animal form and incurring divine wrath, sacrificing victory for spiritual safety. They watched as the relentless Medes and Persians advanced, turning the deeply held sacred beliefs of Egypt into their own deadly vulnerability. A defeat that was not just military, but a profound spiritual annihilation that shattered the Egyptian soul. The fall of Memphis was swift and brutal, following the rout at Pelusium. Pharaoh Psemtic III, Amasis's unfortunate son, was captured, his royal blood offering no shield against the new master of the world. And Egypt, the eternal kingdom, was swallowed by the Achaemenid Ma. Cambyses, now styling himself pharaoh, lord of the two lands, stood atop a mountain of conquest, the undisputed master of the largest empire the world had ever seen. But the view from that summit was blinding, and the weight of ruling began to shatter his mind. History paints Cambyses not just as a conqueror, but as a tyrant descending into stark, unmanageable paranoia and violence, a man utterly corrupted by the sheer, inhuman scale of the power he now wielded over 45% of the world's population. He mocked the Egyptian gods, desecrated ancient temples, and committed acts so horrifying they became the terrified fodder for generations of Egyptian scribes, establishing a legacy of cruelty meant to extinguish any spark of rebellion. The paranoia turned inward, fueled by the isolation of absolute power. Cambyses decided that even Egypt was not enough and launched two disastrous, highly ambitious campaigns into the deep south and west, one aimed at the gold of Nubia, Kush, and another towards the mysterious oracle of Amun in the western desert. The Nubian campaign saw his armies decimated, not by soldiers, but by the relentless scorching heat and the sheer inability to sustain supply lines across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain, forcing the war machine into a desperate, humiliating retreat. The expedition to the Oracle of Amun, aiming to obliterate a spiritual rival, met an even more cinematic and terrifying fate: the legendary 50,000 soldiers swallowed whole by a sudden, colossal sandstorm, vanishing completely into the vast, indifferent emptiness of the Sahara, a punishment from the geography itself. Cambyses, defeated by nature and his own ambition, began his tortured journey back to Persia, only to receive a message that chilled him to the bone and solidified his madness: usurpation. His younger brother, Smerdis, or perhaps an impostor claiming to be him, had seized the throne in his absence, signaling that the empire, cemented by blood, was ready to tear itself apart from the stress of its own impossible size. In a final, desperate, and utterly dramatic act that echoes through time, Cambyses attempted to mount his horse while traveling through Syria, only to fatally wound himself with his own sword in exactly the same spot where he had brutally murdered the sacred Apis bull. A poet's ending for a tyrant's life, and the Achaemenid Empire was suddenly rudderless, facing a profound crisis of legitimacy that threatened to dissolve the colossal entity into dust. The gasp of the empire was deafening. When Darius seized the crown, the colossal realm Cyrus had stitched together and Cambyses had expanded to the very edge of sanity did not merely tremble, it detonated. This was not a smooth transition of power. This was a cataclysmic, simultaneous eruption of rebellion in every major province, a civil war stretching across the known world, testing the very foundation of the Achaemenid dream. Imagine 20 major regional powers, from Babylon to Media, from Egypt to Elam, all declaring independence in the span of a single year, believing the new king was nothing more than a temporary fixture, a puppet ready to be discarded. Darius I, the man history would soon call the Great, did not flinch. While the corpses of his predecessors were still chilling, he executed a military and strategic masterstroke that defied all expectations. He didn't just fight, he systematically, ruthlessly, and with chilling efficiency hunted down every single claimant and every single leader of every single uprising. His own record, carved high into the sheer rock face of the Behistun mountain, stands as the most terrifying autobiography ever written, detailing the chilling precision with which he restored order to absolute chaos. It was the ultimate statement of propaganda and power, etched where no man could easily reach it, proclaiming to the world that Darius was not merely a king by succession, but a king by the undeniable celestial mandate of Ahura Mazda himself. He solidified his claim by spilling the blood of his enemies across the map, winning 19 battles and capturing 9 kings in less than 2 years. The empire was beaten back into submission, but unlike the reigns before him, Darius realized brute force was a temporary measure. He needed something far more insidious, far more permanent: organization. If Cyrus was the architect of the empire's borders, Darius was the legendary engineer of its internal infrastructure. He didn't just rule territory, he transformed it into the world's first true administrative superstate, a machine of governance so complex and efficient it would remain unmatched for 1,000 years. His immediate innovation was the restructuring of the entire dominion into 20 strategically vital satrapies, or provinces, each governed by a satrap, a powerful viceroy chosen solely for their loyalty and administrative acumen. But Darius was a man of profound paranoia, a necessary trait when ruling 45% of humanity. He knew a single man could not be trusted with absolute power over such vast wealth. Therefore, he installed a brilliant system of checks and balances that were designed to generate perpetual internal tension. Alongside the satrap, the civil governor, stood the military commander, who reported directly to Susa, and the royal secretary, who monitored both. And overseeing this entire delicate, dangerous arrangement were the legendary eyes and ears of the king. These were the shadowy inspectors, the secret police of the ancient world, who moved like ghosts along the massive arteries of the empire, appearing without warning to audit accounts, inspect troop readiness, and ensure the satrap was not dreaming of treason. Any deviation from the king's will was instantly relayed back to the throne, often resulting in swift, brutal, and public execution. This iron grip of constant scrutiny kept the vast administrative machine running with lethal precision. To standardize and stabilize this unprecedented economy, Darius introduced the daric, the first widely circulated gold coin in history, a currency of such pure and consistent value that it became the globally accepted standard of trade, simplifying taxation and funding his massive armies. He ordered the standardization of weights and measures across the entire empire, ensuring that a bushel of grain in Egypt was the same quantity as a bushel in Bactria. He even decreed Aramaic as the official language of imperial communication, cementing cultural uniformity through bureaucratic necessity. But the true masterpiece, the defining symbol of Achaemenid connectivity, was the Royal Road. Stretching over 1,600 miles of engineered perfection, this road linked Sardis in the west all the way to Susa and Persepolis in the east. It was the ancient world's information superhighway, allowing royal messengers, the famed Persian couriers, to cover the entire distance in just 7 days, a journey that would take a normal traveler 3 months. This speed of communication was the secret weapon of the empire, allowing Darius to react to threats and manage logistics with unheard-of rapidity, transforming the concept of time and distance into a tool of imperial control. While he built his monumental capital at Persepolis, a magnificent city designed not just for governance but to awe and dominate the subject peoples with its impossible scale, Darius was still a conqueror at heart. His ambition was a hungry beast. He expanded eastward into the Indus Valley, securing what is now modern Pakistan and creating the 20th satrapy, the wealthiest of them all. But the real drama lay to the north and the west. He embarked on a colossal, nearly suicidal campaign against the Scythian tribes across the Danube, a punishing, frustrating war of attrition that taught him the limits of imperial reach when faced with nomadic fury and endless steppes. Yet, that Scythian campaign inadvertently brought him into direct contact with the volatile, fractious world of the Aegean. When the Ionian Greeks, his own subjects on the western coast of Anatolia, dared to rise up in a desperate revolt, egged on by tiny, distant city-states across the sea like Athens, the sleeping giant was finally provoked. The Ionian revolt was swiftly crushed with terrifying force. But the actions of those small, defiant city-states, throwing fire into Sardis and defying the King of Kings, could not be ignored. Darius's gaze, now sharp and filled with lethal intent, was locked onto a small rocky peninsula where democracy was still a dangerous, untested experiment, and the stage was set for the most famous clash in ancient history. The moment Persia decided it needed to teach the Greeks a lesson in imperial hierarchy. Darius stood at the absolute zenith of human power, ruling over a territory so vast it defied the compass. But even the god king could not tolerate the stinging mosquito bite emanating from the western edge of his world, those unruly Greek cities of Ionia. They were vassals, they were subjects, and yet, fueled by the intoxicating, dangerous idea of self-rule, they decided to light a match that would set the ancient world ablaze. The year was 499 BCE, and the Ionian Revolt wasn't just a local uprising. It was an act of existential defiance against the largest military machine ever conceived. When the Ionians dared to march on and burn Sardis, the major Persian administrative capital in Anatolia, the flames didn't just consume wood and stone. They burned Darius's patience down to ash. And then, the unforgivable betrayal. Two tiny, insignificant city-states, Athens and Eretria, sent mere ships, a handful of triremes, to aid the rebels. To Darius, this wasn't assistance. It was a declaration of war, an act of supreme hubris from petty tribal villages situated at the fringe of his known universe. Legend says Darius called for a servant to repeat 3 times every day, "Master, remember the Athenians." This was not just a diplomatic crisis, it was a cosmic imbalance that required immediate, violent correction. The Persian Empire mobilized, not for conquest initially, but for a lesson in obedience so brutal it would echo through time. The first strike, led by Mardonius in 492 BCE, was swallowed whole by a sudden, terrifying storm off Mount Athos, a disaster that cost the king hundreds of ships and thousands of men, a terrifying omen that the Greeks later cherished as divine intervention. But the great king was relentless. He simply doubled down, demanding submission. 2 years later, in 490 BCE, the second, meticulously planned, terrifying expedition arrived by sea, guided by the generals Datis and Artaphernes. Their goal? Not just to punish the rebels, but to deliver the heads of the Athenians and Erythrians to Susa. The sheer scale of the Persian invasion force, tens of thousands of infantry and cavalry, was designed to paralyze the enemy with fear before a single arrow was loosed. They landed on the quiet, unassuming plain of Marathon, a perfect killing field, expecting the Athenians to immediately break and scatter before the overwhelming sight of the immortals' advanced guard. But Athens was not Sparta. It was a city built on radical, messy democracy, and in that democracy, an impossible decision had to be made: submit and survive as subjects, or fight and die for freedom. Their fate rested on the shoulders of Miltiades, a brilliant Athenian general who actually understood the Persian fighting style, having once served as a semi-vassal under Darius himself. He knew that if Athens stayed behind its walls, the city would inevitably be surrounded and starved out. The only chance, the only insane roll of the dice, was to meet the Leviathan head-on. What followed was one of the most astonishing tactical reversals in military history. The Athenians, augmented by a small contingent from Plataea, deliberately weakened their center line, stretching their numbers thin to match the width of the Persian front. This looked like suicide, a fatal error that the Persian commanders immediately exploited, pressing forward with confidence. But this was a trap crafted by a master strategist. As the Persian center surged forward, tasting victory, the heavily armored Athenian wings slammed inward, wrapping around the Persian flanks like massive iron pincers. The sheer shock and brutality of the Hellenic hoplite charge, the coordinated phalanx moving as a single, unstoppable entity, was something the Persian army had never truly encountered. They were professional soldiers, yes, but their light armor and reliance on archery proved disastrously ineffective against the crushing weight of bronze and shield. The Persians were routed, collapsing in panicked disarray, attempting desperately to flee back to their ships. The miracle of Marathon was complete. Athens had defeated the invincible army of the God King. The famous dash of the messenger Phidippides, running the 26 miles back to Athens to declare, "We have won," before collapsing dead, was the dramatic exclamation point on a victory that fundamentally changed the trajectory of Western civilization. It was a victory measured not just in bodies, but in the belief that the seemingly impossible could be achieved. The news that reached Susa was unthinkable. The great king had suffered a devastating, humiliating defeat at the hands of a mere handful of rebellious farmers and philosophers. Darius immediately began planning the truly colossal invasion, one that would wipe Greece from the map entirely and salt the earth where Athens once stood. Xerxes inherited the largest empire on earth, but he also inherited the most pressing, dangerous, and emotionally charged unresolved conflict. This wasn't just about territory or resources anymore. It was about the honor of the Achaemenid dynasty itself. The planning began immediately, a decade-long military-industrial project that was truly unprecedented in human history. Xerxes was not going to send a punitive raid. He was going to send an entire continent of men to crush a peninsula. The sheer logistical nightmare of moving an army of this rumored size, estimated by ancient sources to be millions, though modern historians suggest hundreds of thousands, was staggering, requiring engineering feats that bordered on mythical. To ensure the failure of 492 BCE was not repeated, Xerxes ordered the construction of a massive, audacious canal cut clean through the Mount Athos Peninsula, a 3-year project involving thousands of laborers, designed solely to allow the fleet to bypass the treacherous waters that had once devoured his father's ships. It was an act of extreme imperial arrogance, a monument to defiance against nature itself. But the true spectacle, the true terrifying declaration of Persian intent, was the bridging of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe. Xerxes commanded his engineers to lash together hundreds of triremes and merchant ships side by side, forming 2 massive pontoons anchored by vast cables made of flax and papyrus, creating a floating road across the sea. The world held its breath. As the massive army began its slow, inevitable march toward the west, stepping across that miraculous bridge, it was clear this was not merely war. It was the entire East descending upon the tiny, fractured states of Greece. The stage was set for Thermopylae, a showdown where one small group of men would attempt the impossible one final time. They knew that land warfare against the mobilized might of the empire was suicide. The true battleground would be the sea, where the heavy, maneuverable triremes of the Hellenic world might stand a chance against the larger, often Phoenician and Egyptian crewed, but less strategically cohesive Persian armada. Xerxes demanded earth and water, the customary signs of submission, from nearly every Greek state. Most of the northern cities, facing the immediate threat of annihilation, conceded. But the core of the Hellenic world, led by Sparta and Athens, drew a terrifying line in the sand. They would fight, even if it meant the end of their world. The Persian advance was relentless, a river of humanity flowing across the engineered Hellespont Bridge for 7 days and 7 nights, consuming all resources in its path. Imagine the sight. The immortals, the famed elite guard, adorned in gold and jewelry, flanked by Medes, Babylonians, Indians, and Egyptians, every corner of the known world answering the call of the Achaemenid king. This was the largest single military mobilization the world would see until the Napoleonic Wars, a scale of conflict that warped the fabric of reality for those living on the receiving end. The great mountain passes of Greece were the last bottleneck, the only hope for a fragmented, outnumbered defense force. The Greeks chose Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, a ridiculously narrow coastal pass, where the sheer numbers of the Persian host would be rendered meaningless, where thousands of men could only fight through a space wide enough for perhaps 5 soldiers abreast. It was a perfect choke point, a tactical masterstroke of geography. But Thermopylae was not chosen for victory. It was chosen for delay. It was a sacrifice, a desperate gambit to buy the precious time needed for the Athenian fleet to be fully armed, trained, and positioned to execute Themistocles' grand, desperate strategy. The Spartan king Leonidas was chosen to lead the defensive force, a man whose name would soon become synonymous with ultimate, defiant courage. He took with him his personal bodyguard of 300 Spartans, fully aware that this was not a mission, but an execution. The Persians arrived, stretching endlessly across the horizon, their numbers so vast that the locals warned the Greeks that the Persian arrows would blot out the sun. Leonidas's reply was immortal. "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." The stage was set for the ultimate brutal defense of Western freedom against Eastern might, a battle that should have been an easy, crushing Persian victory, but which became the legendary crucible of Spartan defiance. The world held its breath after Marathon, but the world also foolishly believed that the insult to the great king Darius was merely a skirmish, a temporary embarrassment he would eventually rectify. But Darius was gone, pulled from the stage by the Grim Reaper's cold, impersonal hand, having sworn vengeance he could not deliver. Now his son, Xerxes I, sat upon the peacock throne, inheriting not just the largest empire the world had ever seen, but inheriting a blood debt and a sacred, inescapable mission to erase the stain of Greek impudence and turn the entire Aegean Sea into nothing more than an imperial Persian lake. Xerxes did not just send an army. He mobilized a continent, orchestrating a feat of logistics and engineering that still defies modern understanding. The scale of his preparations was so immense that even conservative estimates place the fighting force well over 300,000 combatants, a number that required a support chain 3 times that size, moving across arid lands and volatile seas. Think about the sheer, overwhelming effort required. A unified command, coordinating soldiers speaking dozens of different languages, Medes, Lydians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, all marching toward one tiny, militarily insignificant peninsula that had dared to suggest the empire was anything less than invincible. He was not just conquering Greece. He was performing an act of world historical magnification, ensuring his name would echo forever as the man who commanded the very elements. He built bridges where no bridges should exist, monuments to his absolute command over nature itself, proving that the great king was not bound by the limitations of common men or common geography. The infamous pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, a mile-wide strait of turbulent water, was not just one bridge but two, lashed together by massive Egyptian linen and papyrus cables, strong enough to bear the entire, terrifying weight of the imperial guard, the 10,000 immortals, across the running water of the sea. When a sudden, violent storm dared to tear the first structure apart, Xerxes didn't simply order a rebuild. The legend, which speaks volumes about his megalomaniacal fury, asserts that he ordered the water itself to be whipped 300 times and branded with hot irons, a symbolic punishment that signaled to every soldier and every vassal state, nothing, not even the churning ocean, stands in the way of the great king's will and the march of the Achaemenid destiny. And then there was Mount Athos. To avoid the disaster that had tragically wrecked Mardonius's fleet years earlier, Xerxes commanded the unbelievable excavation of a massive mile-and-a-half-long canal through solid rock, slicing through the mountainous peninsula, the first and arguably the most ambitious feat of naval engineering in ancient history. This monumental effort was not strictly necessary for his victory. It was a terrifying physical demonstration of power. He wanted the Greeks to know, long before they saw the dust cloud of his advance, that they weren't fighting an army. They were fighting a force that literally rearranged the geography of the planet at its monarch's whim. The sheer volume of men drinking from rivers literally caused the water levels to drop. They devoured the lands they crossed, leaving famine and ruin in their wake, a massive, unstoppable plague of humanity advancing relentlessly southward. The hopelessly divided Greek city-states, paralyzed by petty internal squabbles and the sheer, debilitating terror of the approaching storm, finally met at Corinth, forced to realize that unless they fought together, they would be swallowed separately, their cultures erased, their freedoms extinguished. Their decision was strategically desperate, yet historically brilliant. They must hold the line at the narrowest possible choke point, where the sheer, crushing force of Persian numbers would cease to matter. They chose Thermopylae, the hot gates, a sliver of land between sheer, unforgiving mountains and the sea, a perfect bottleneck. This strategic position was defended by a small yet dedicated coalition, but it was spearheaded by the most feared, mythologized warriors the world had ever produced. We are talking about 300 Spartans, the elite, the men who had been trained since childhood for nothing but the moment of glorious death in tight formation. The narrative often forgets the 700 brave Thespians, the 400 politically conflicted Thebans, and the thousands of other doomed Greeks who stood beside them, but make no mistake, it was the presence of Leonidas, the Spartan king, that transformed a desperate defense into an immortal legend. Xerxes, watching from his ivory chair of command, initially refused to believe the reports flowing in from his scouts. Why were they not fleeing? Why were these pathetic few refusing to bow before the majesty of the great king? He waited 4 full days, offering them the chance to surrender, believing their courage was merely a desperate, fleeting bravado that would dissolve in the face of true power. When they stood fast, refusing to move, he unleashed the Medes, the fierce vanguard of his invasion, confident they would sweep the Greeks into the sea by lunchtime, a mere footnote in his grand design. What followed was a devastating, unbelievable massacre of Persian forces. The Spartan phalanx was not just a wall of bronze and wood. It was a living, breathing, coordinated killing machine trained to execute complex, shield-shattering maneuvers mid-battle, feigning retreat only to spin and shatter the disorganized pursuers who broke ranks. But the greatest empires are not defeated by frontal assault. They are often defeated by internal failure and the pathetic rot of human weakness. Enter Ephialtes, the local resident, a man whose name has become eternally synonymous with treason and self-serving betrayal for millennia. For a promise of gold, Ephialtes revealed the secret goat path, the Anapeia, that snaked over the sheer mountains, allowing an entire flanking maneuver to bypass the bottleneck and attack the Greeks from behind. When Leonidas learned of the betrayal, that the immortals, the elite of the Persian force, were already marching swiftly toward his rear, he made the single most defining, terrifying military decision in ancient history. He dismissed the majority of the allied forces, ordering them to flee and warn the south, saving the future of Greek freedom by buying them precious time. He kept only those who volunteered for certain absolute death, the 300 Spartans, the Thespians who chose glory over survival, and the conflictive Thebans whom he kept close to monitor their loyalty. This wasn't suicide. It was a conscious, brutally calculated sacrifice. By delaying the Persians for a few more desperate hours, by forcing Xerxes to pay the highest possible blood-soaked price for this victory, Leonidas bought the essential time necessary for the Athenian fleet to assemble and for the rest of Greece to prepare for the inevitable brutal fight to come. The final stand was a frenzy of desperate close-quarters combat, the Spartans fighting until their spears broke into splinters, then using their short swords, then their hands and teeth, falling one by one under a literal suffocating hail of arrows, transforming that insignificant mountain pass into the most hallowed, revered ground in military history. The hot gates were now the gates of glorious, necessary death. But the strategic clock had been irreversibly reset. The sacrifice at the hot gates bought days, not salvation. The road to central Greece, once guarded by mountains, now lay wide open, a gaping, bleeding wound leading straight to the heart of Hellenic civilization. Xerxes, fueled by the humiliation of Marathon and the perceived insolence of those 300 Spartans, did not just march, he unleashed a geological event upon the landscape. The Persian army, a human ocean that stretched further than the eye could see, poured through the shattered remnants of Phocis and Boeotia, their eyes fixed on the ultimate prize, the city that had dared to defy the King of Kings. This was not war. This was divine retribution, delivered by the greatest army the world had ever seen, a wave of vengeance sweeping over Attica. The panic was absolute, a terror so profound it froze the very air. But the Athenians, guided by the cold, calculating genius of Themistocles, had already made the impossible decision. They would abandon the stones of their city to save the soul of their nation. He had convinced the Athenians to entrust their fate to the wooden walls, the massive revolutionary fleet of 200 triremes they had constructed just years earlier, using unexpected silver wealth to build instruments of war. They evacuated every citizen, woman, and child onto ships bound for the island of Salamis, watching from the sea as their homeland awaited its fiery fate. But Xerxes craved more than surrender. He craved symbolic obliteration, the burning of the memory of defiance. The Acropolis, the gleaming sacred pinnacle of Athenian identity, was immediately overrun. The temples, the very altars of their gods were torched, consumed by flames that licked the Ionian sky, signaling the death of Greek pride and the total, crushing victory of the Achaemenid Empire. The fires of Athens served as a beacon of terror, illuminating the desperate, narrow Strait of Salamis, where the combined, ragged Greek fleet now huddled. Their strategy was brutally simple, yet insanely high stakes: lure the massive, unwieldy Persian navy into a confined space, where sheer numbers, the very strength of the empire, became a fatal handicap. The Persian fleet, though still numerically superior, consisting of powerful Phoenician, Egyptian, and Ionian contingents, perhaps 800 ships against 370 Greek triremes, was already fatigued, its supply lines stretched taut, and its commanders growing arrogant with the effortless success on land. Xerxes himself, eager to witness the final, crushing blow to Greek resistance, ordered the construction of a magnificent golden throne high upon the slopes of Mount Aigaleo overlooking the strait. He would be the witness, the judge, and the executioner of Hellenic naval power. But this is where the psychological warfare reached its terrifying climax. Themistocles, knowing that the Peloponnesian contingent was wavering and considering retreat, executed one of the most audacious deceptions in military history. He sent a trusted slave, Sicinnus, to Xerxes with a fabricated message. The message whispered a fatal lie. The Greeks were terrified, planning to slip away overnight, fragmenting their forces. If the king acted immediately, he could surround and crush the entire Greek navy easily, ending the war in one stroke without prolonged struggle. Xerxes swallowed the bait, hook, line, and sinker. Why wouldn't he? He had just burned their capital. They should be running. The king immediately ordered his fleet to blockade both entrances to the strait, maneuvering his massive armada into the narrow, treacherous, rock-strewn killing field. The trap was sprung. Dawn broke on September 28, 480 BCE, revealing a scene of absolute claustrophobic dread. The Persians sailed confidently into the strait, their massive contingents expecting an easy route, oblivious to the shallow, unpredictable nature of the waters and the fickle winds. But the Greeks, smaller, faster, and masters of these specific currents, waited like coiled vipers. As the Persians pressed forward, their oars tangled, their hulls scraped rocks, and the sheer density of their formation meant they couldn't respond to the quick, deadly ramming attacks of the lighter, more agile Greek triremes. From his gilded perch, Xerxes watched his mighty armada shatter into kindling. Ship after ship was splintered, sending thousands of his best sailors into the cold Aegean waters. This was not a defeat. It was an annihilation, a strategic catastrophe that defied belief. The Battle of Salamis instantly severed the lifeline of the Persian war machine. Without naval dominance, Xerxes could no longer supply his massive land army, which still occupied Greece. The logistics of feeding and arming hundreds of thousands of men across the Aegean Sea suddenly became an impossible nightmare. Xerxes knew, deep in his kingly bones, that the game had changed. He had conquered Athens, yes, but he had lost the war's critical momentum, and now the terrifying threat of internal rebellion in his own sprawling empire loomed large if he stayed too long in this hostile land. He made the agonizing decision. He would retreat back to Anatolia, taking the bulk of his army. But he was far too proud to admit defeat. He left behind his finest general, Mardonius, with a smaller, hand-picked force of 300,000 elite troops, tasked with finishing the job on land. It was a desperate, deadly gamble, leaving the fate of the Achaemenid future hanging precariously on a single, final land battle. The air was thick, not with the dust of battle, but with the suffocating anxiety of waiting. 300,000 souls, the absolute pinnacle of Achaemenid military power, stood ready. They were the hammer forged in the heart of Pasargada, ready to fall. But where was the anvil? This was not the orderly, glorious warfare Darius I had mastered on the plains of Babylon or against the false Smyrtus. This was a ghost hunt, a campaign launched into the teeth of an impossible landscape and against an enemy that simply refused to fight. They had marched thousands of miles, their supply lines stretched thinner than spider silk across the hostile terrain, burning under a sun that seemed determined to melt the very bronze of their armor. The logistics of feeding this moving city of men, horses, and baggage train consumed resources that could have funded 3 years of palace construction in Susa. The enemy, let us call them the Shadows, did not offer a pitched battle. They adopted the most terrifying strategy imaginable: total evasion. They retreated, destroying every well, every patch of grazable land, every potential cache of provisions in their wake. They turned their own homeland into a fatal trap, a vast, scorched earth policy designed to starve the Persian Goliath into submission before a single sword was drawn. Darius's generals, veterans of dozens of decisive victories, watched in impotent fury as their meticulously planned maneuvers dissolved into meaningless, exhausting chases. The Persian army, designed to crush standing armies, was instead being bled dry by dehydration, dysentery, and demoralization. Every day was a victory for the enemy without even drawing a bow. This was the horrific realization dawning upon the King of Kings. He could conquer every fortress, but he could not conquer the relentless, unforgiving landscape. The cost became astronomical, a silent tax levied by the desert itself. Horses were dying by the thousands, not from arrows, but from thirst. The elite immortals, the very standard of Persian perfection, were beginning to show the strain, their golden armor dulled by dust and despair. It was a war against geography and hunger, two enemies the King of Kings could not command, two enemies that never tired. Darius realized, with a chill that went deeper than the desert nights, that continuing this pursuit was not a path to victory, but a guarantee of annihilation, a slow-motion catastrophe for his entire dynasty. He had to pivot, to cut his losses, but how could the Lord of Asia retreat without shattering the myth of his invincibility? The reputation of the Achaemenid Empire was built on the premise that what they reached for, they took. A failed campaign was an invitation for every vassal state, from Egypt to Ionia, to rise up and tear the empire apart. The order came down, heavy and terrifying: retreat. But a strategic retreat for an army of 300,000 men fighting starvation hundreds of miles from home is not an orderly march. It is a controlled collapse. Darius used every scrap of his organizational genius to save the core of his forces, sacrificing the outer edges, the non-essential baggage, and thousands of auxiliary troops to secure the retreat route back across the massive pontoon bridge he had constructed. This was not a defeat in the traditional sense, for no banner was captured and no general was killed in pitched battle, but it was a profound, deeply humiliating scar on the history of the empire. The immense effort to secure the European flank had resulted in nothing but a crippling logistical debt, and the clear realization that the edges of the known world held dangers that even the greatest army could not overcome. The Scythians, or whoever these elusive fighters were, had taught the Achaemenids a lesson in humility, etching it in the bleached bones left behind on the desolate plains. The great hammer had failed to find purchase, and the reverberations of that failure traveled instantly like a shock wave across the entire dominion. The moment news of the strategic withdrawal filtered back through the labyrinthine communication network of the empire, the geopolitical plates began to shift violently. The failure to secure the edge was interpreted not as logistical difficulty, but as weakness, a fatal, exploitable flaw in the armor of the King of Kings. The first to grasp this opportunity, the first to truly light the catastrophic fire that would consume Persian resources for the next 50 years, were the Ionian Greeks. They were located on the western coast of Anatolia, ostensibly loyal subjects, yet always chafing under the satrap rule and the enforced installation of local tyrants sympathetic to Susa. They saw Darius's retreat as the sign they had been waiting for, the moment the giant stumbled, the time for the mice to chew through the ropes. The Ionian revolt did not begin as a unified, glorious uprising, but as a series of desperate, localized insurrections, quickly escalating into a full-scale regional conflict that demanded immediate, brutal suppression. The Ionian rebels, sensing blood in the water, knew they could not win alone against the full might of the empire. They needed allies, however small, however distant. Their gaze fell upon the tiny, fractious city-states across the Aegean Sea, the people who shared their language and their strange, rebellious spirit. The key, the truly infuriating catalyst that turned this regional annoyance into a matter of imperial honor was the intervention of mainland Greece, specifically two city-states, far smaller and far less significant than the vast, wealthy satrapies of the East, dared to send aid: Athens and Eretria. When the Athenians sent 20 ships, a paltry force in the grand scheme of Achaemenid naval power, to assist their Ionian kin in attacking the Persian regional capital of Sardis, they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Sardis, the seat of the powerful satrap Artaphernes, was a symbol of Persian permanence in the West, its treasury legendary. Its burning, visible for miles as the Greek rebels put the torch to it, was more than just a military setback. It was a profound public insult directed squarely at the throne of Darius the Great. The sight of Athenian hoplites setting fire to the heart of their western dominion solidified Darius's resolve. Greece was no longer a peripheral issue, no longer a footnote in the grand strategy. It was a debt of vengeance that had to be paid in blood, a stain that demanded complete eradication from the map. The age of small skirmishes was over. The Persian Wars had begun. The roar of the great king was not just heard across the plains of Susa, it was felt in the tiny, fragile harbors of the Aegean. Darius the Great, master of everything the sun touched, had personalized the conflict. He wasn't waging a geopolitical campaign. He was exacting a private, intimate vengeance against the audacious little democracy that dared to light the fires of rebellion within his borders: Athens. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. He had instructed his servants every single morning to whisper 3 devastating words into his ear. "Sire, remember the Athenians." This was history's most terrifying alarm clock, a constant, burning reminder of the insult, an unforgivable stain on the golden tapestry of the Achaemenid dynasty. The mobilization that followed was unlike anything the world had ever conceived. This was not a punitive raid. This was the hammer of the known world descending to crush a walnut, a total commitment of imperial might against a nuisance. Fleets were constructed in distant Phoenician shipyards, requisitioning timber from forests that had stood since the dawn of time, stripping entire mountains bare to feed the naval appetite of the great king. Millions of rations were stockpiled, requiring the taxation and coordination of nearly half the planet's populace just to feed the supply lines. The very sea, the vast, shimmering Aegean, was about to be darkened by a shadow too immense to comprehend, a shadow cast by hundreds upon hundreds of triremes, packed gunwale to gunwale with the finest shock troops and elite archers of the Persian military machine. In Greece, the news arrived not as intelligence but as paralyzing terror. Imagine being a farmer in Attica, hearing whispers that the empire spanning 3 continents was aiming its entire operational focus directly at your small patch of rocky soil. That absolute obliteration was sailing toward your horizon. The Hellenes were utterly fractured, consumed by petty rivalries and centuries-old grudges. They were not a nation. They were a collection of bickering, terrified city-states arguing over philosophy while the greatest military force in existence prepared to turn their world to cinder. Sparta, the famed military powerhouse, was paralyzed, caught up in religious festivals, a convenient excuse, perhaps, to avoid facing a force they believed was utterly invincible, demonstrating the profound division and self-preservation that gripped the Greek world. But the reckoning could not wait for Spartan bravery. In 490 BC, the inevitable arrived. The Persian fleet, led by the tactical genius Darius, chose the Bay of Marathon as their staging ground, a pristine, shallow crescent of beach perfect for unloading cavalry and overwhelming infantry. The sight must have been utterly demoralizing. Wave after wave of ships disgorged their terrifying payload, the shore suddenly swarming with the rainbow armies of the East, Medes, Sakai, Indians, Babylonians, all marching under the winged banner of Ahura Mazda, their colors blindingly vibrant against the pale Greek stone. The Athenians, who had dared the insult, were now standing alone, facing a force estimated to be at least twice, perhaps 3 times, their own meager strength, their fate hanging by the thinnest thread of desperate courage. They could have retreated behind their walls. They should have waited for the cowardly Spartans. But retreat meant surrender, and surrender meant the extinction of their revolutionary idea called democracy. Against the advice of caution and self-preservation, the Athenian general Miltiades made a decision that defied all military logic and remains the boldest gamble in ancient history. He understood the strength of the Persian cavalry, those terrifying mounted archers who could chew up an unorganized infantry line from a distance, turning the open plain into a meat grinder. He knew that waiting to fight was suicide, allowing the Persians to dictate the terms. Yet he chose to fight now, before the Persians could fully deploy, before the terror fully broke the morale of his citizen soldiers. This was less a battle plan and more a desperate, suicidal cry against the crushing weight of fate, betting everything on one singular, explosive moment. His tactical innovation was an act of desperate genius, a move born from the necessity of facing a numerical tsunami. Instead of creating a deep, impenetrable phalanx, Miltiades thinned out his center line until it was almost dangerously fragile, channeling the bulk of his heavily armored hoplites into the flanks. Why? He wanted the Persians to break through the middle. He wanted them to believe they had won the moment they reached the core, drawing the elite Persian and Saka troops deeper into the killing zone, a masterful manipulation of enemy psychology. When the signal was given, it wasn't a cautious advance. It was the legendary, utterly insane charge of the Athenian hoplites, running a full mile across the open ground, an unheard-of feat for heavily armed infantry, their bronze armor flashing in the morning sun. They ran to negate the lethal rain of Persian arrows, turning a prolonged, grinding battle into a sudden, explosive collision, sacrificing exhaustion for the element of absolute surprise. The momentum hit the Persian line like a physical shockwave. The center buckled immediately, exactly as Miltiades planned, drawing the best of the imperial troops into the trap, celebrating their easy victory over the thin Greek line. But then, the monstrous flanks closed in, the deep Athenian phalanxes wrapping around the exposed Persian wings like the jaws of a titan snapping shut. The invincible empire had been defeated by a handful of farmers and philosophers. It was a victory so profound, so utterly unforeseen, that it instantly redefined the balance of power in the ancient world, proving that courage could sometimes trump overwhelming might. But even as the cheers erupted and the legendary runner Phidippides sprinted the 26 miles back to Athens to deliver the single life-defining word, Nike, victory, before collapsing and dying, the Athenians knew the chilling truth. This was merely the first furious sneeze of the great king. The real apocalyptic storm was still gathering, waiting only for the sun to rise on a new, vengeful dawn, and the wrath of an emperor who never, ever accepted failure. The air in Susa was thick, not with the pleasant scent of cedar, but with the palpable, choking fumes of pure, unadulterated imperial rage. Darius the Great, the King of Kings, who commanded armies that drank rivers dry, had suffered the ultimate indignity, a slap from a few insignificant, rocky city-states clinging to the edge of his world. He had crushed the Ionian revolt, yes, extinguishing the fire that had dared to lick at the edges of his glorious tapestry. But the memory of Sardis burning, that insult committed by Athenians and Eretrians, was a poison he could not purge. He needed annihilation, a geological event disguised as a military campaign. This was not just war. This was the great king organizing the literal movement of continents. The Mediterranean needed to be tamed. The savage West taught a lesson in obedience so profound that future generations would only speak the word Persia in hushed, terrified whispers. Every satrap, from the deserts of Egypt to the frozen steppes of Central Asia, received the decree: send men, send gold, send grain, send ships. The logistics were staggering, a horror movie for any quartermaster. Imagine mobilizing 600 triremes, each requiring hundreds of rowers, provisions for months, and maintenance crews dedicated to ensuring the massive supply line did not snap under its own impossible weight. The sheer administrative genius required to feed an army that could populate a major city was the silent, terrifying weapon of the Achaemenids, designed to crush the enemy before they even saw a sword. The mobilization itself was an act of aggression, a display of power calculated to break the Western spirit simply by existing. Darius was not sending an army, he was sending an entire floating city dedicated to vengeance. The first attempt to bring the hammer down was entrusted to Mardonius, Darius's young son-in-law, a commander known for his ambition and his sometimes fatal lack of caution. The goal was simple: solidify Persia's hold on Thrace and Macedonia, then pivot south into the vulnerable heart of mainland Greece. But the gods themselves seemed to rebel against this audacious encroachment. As Mardonius's colossal fleet rounded the infamous Mount Athos Peninsula in 492 BCE, a navigational nightmare even in peacetime, the sea decided to swallow the king's navy whole. This was not a mere naval disaster. This was a watery apocalypse. A gale of unbelievable fury erupted from the north, smashing 300 ships meticulously built over years, against the jagged, unforgiving rocks of the coastline. 20,000 men, veterans, archers, and sailors alike, drowned instantly in the churning foam, ripped apart by the wrath of the Aegean. The first strike had failed before it even landed, a devastating omen of the resistance the West would offer. Darius had lost more men to the weather than he had to years of fighting rebels. But failure only sharpened the blade of the King of Kings. He would simply try again, with greater speed and even greater ruthlessness. Darius learned his lesson: bypass the treacherous Athos and strike directly, swiftly, and surgically across the Aegean. His target was not just Athens, but Eretria, the smaller, wealthier island city that had also participated in the burning of Sardis. They were to be made an example, a terror demonstration broadcast across the known world. Command was given to two seasoned generals, Datis, a ruthless Median admiral, and Artaphernes, a strategic genius who happened to be a nephew of the great king. Their mission was horrifyingly clear: capture the populations of Eretria and Athens, shackle them, and bring them back to Susa for public execution or enslavement, a ritual humiliation designed to paralyze the rest of Greece with fear. The fleet sailed across the Aegean in 490 BCE, a sight of truly horrifying beauty. 600 massive ships appearing on the horizon like a swarm of black locusts, devouring the sunlight. They first landed on Naxos, leveling the city and systematically burning every temple, sending an unmistakable message of doom echoing across the Cyclades. When they reached Eretria, the inhabitants prepared for a desperate siege. The walls were high, the resolve seemed strong, but gold, as always, proved to be the ultimate corrosive acid. Traders within the city, their pockets lined with Persian darics, opened the gates under the cover of night, and the fate of Eretria was sealed in blood and smoke. The city was ruthlessly sacked and systematically stripped bare. Every Eritrean man, woman, and child was rounded up and prepared for the long, humiliating voyage back to Persia. The message was delivered with brutal finality. You defied the king, now you are chattel. Your gods cannot save you. With Eretria reduced to smoldering ash, the Persian fleet sailed due west, looking for the softest beachhead closest to the primary target, Athens. The decision was made quickly and strategically. The Bay of Marathon, a broad, flat plain perfect for deploying the terrifying synchronized might of the Persian cavalry and the endless ranks of their elite archers and infantry. For the Athenians, the horror was total and immediate. Their ally was gone, annihilated, and now the largest invading force ever seen in the West was disembarking just 26 miles from their fragile walls. Panic was an infectious disease spreading through the city, threatening to lead to the same treachery that had undone Eretria. They had one desperate, insane hope, one single, terrifying strategy: meet the enemy outside the walls, on that vast, terrifying plain, before the siege could begin. The Athenians scraped together every available hoplite, every farmer, every citizen soldier, numbering perhaps 10,000 men, a fraction of the power they faced. They sent their fastest runner, the legendary Phidippides, on an impossible, desperate dash south to Sparta, begging for aid, for salvation. A 150-mile run in less than 48 hours, a feat of human endurance demanded by sheer existential terror. Phidippides arrived, breathless, delivering the message of impending catastrophic doom. But the Spartans, bound by ancient, unbreakable religious custom, refused to march until the moon was full. They promised help, but warned it would be too late to save Athens. Athens was truly alone, facing perhaps 3 times their number, against the mobilized might of the immortal empire, on a field chosen specifically by the enemy to maximize their own advantages. This was not a battle plan. This was a prayer whispered in the face of certain, absolute extinction. The stage was set for the impossible, the moment history remembers as the defining earthquake of antiquity, where the fate of Western civilization rested on the shield of a few thousand desperate farmers. The impossible stand was now a reality, but the farmers were facing not just a king, but the entirety of the known world's mechanized fury. The sheer scale of what was coming defied human comprehension, a dark wave rising from the east that promised to drown the small, chaotic fire of Athenian democracy forever. Darius the Great, the King of Kings, inheritor of the largest empire humanity had ever conceived, viewed the troublesome Greek city-states as little more than gnats buzzing around the edges of his flawless golden carpet. This was not a war of conquest. This was an administrative annoyance that needed swift, brutal correction, a punitive strike so overwhelming it would serve as a chilling lesson for all future rebels across his vast domains. The spark that ignited this world war had been the audacious Ionian revolt, where these Hellenic colonists dared to raise their heads against the iron fist of the satraps, believing they could defy the master of all lands. Athens, in a moment of monumental, historical stupidity, or perhaps transcendental bravery, depending on which ancient chronicler you trust, sent a handful of ships, barely 20 triremes, to aid their distant brethren in Samos and Miletus. That tiny fleet was a declaration of war against the sun itself, a pinprick that registered as a cataclysmic insult in the gilded halls of Susa. When Ionia was crushed and the rebellious city of Miletus was wiped from the map, its population enslaved and its memory erased, Darius swore an oath of vengeance so chilling that it echoed across the Aegean Sea. He demanded the world know that no one defied the Achaemenid crown and survived to tell the tale of it, especially not these irritating, verbose Greeks. The mobilization of the invasion force was an economic event greater than any construction project since the pyramids, a logistical marvel orchestrated by the finest minds in the empire. Ships were built in Phoenicia and Egypt. Soldiers were drawn from 30 different nationalities, Scythians, Indians, Babylonians, and Medes, speaking a Tower of Babel of languages, all marching toward one single, terrifying objective: the obliteration of Athens and Sparta. His initial attempts were plagued by the fury of the gods. The storm at Mount Athos, a catastrophe that swallowed hundreds of warships and thousands of lives, proving that the Aegean was not yet ready to yield to Xerxes' father. But Darius was not deterred. He was a man who conquered oceans through sheer, relentless will and the inexhaustible resources of his empire, planning the next strike with cold, imperial precision. In 490 BCE, the great host finally sailed, this time guided safely across the sea by the general Datis and the strategist Artaphernes, bypassing the treacherous Athos Peninsula. They landed on the shores of Attica, choosing the unassuming flat plains of Marathon, a strategic blunder perhaps, but a logistical triumph that allowed their massive numbers to disembark rapidly. The Persian cavalry, the finest shock troops in the known world, poured onto the beachhead, their armor glinting like a fatal promise to the small, scattered populations of Attica. The sheer, visceral terror that gripped Athens at that moment is unimaginable. They could see the smoke on the horizon, smell the dust of the approaching empire, and knew the fate that awaited them. They knew what happened to cities that resisted. They vanished, their temples burned, their people scattered to the winds. The only hope was a desperate plea to Sparta, the legendary war machine, delivered by the runner Phidippides, who covered the 150 miles in less than 2 days. Sparta, tragically, was preoccupied with the sacred Carnia festival, bound by religious law to wait several days before marching, a delay that placed the entire future of Western thought on the shoulders of the Athenians alone. The Athenians and their tiny contingent of Plataean allies stood alone, fewer than 10,000 desperate men facing an army that historians place anywhere between 25,000 and 60,000, a crushing numerical superiority. It was the definition of an impossible fight, a scenario where mathematics proved that civilization, as we know it, was about to be extinguished by the weight of the East. Enter Miltiades, the Athenian general whose name should be whispered with the awe usually reserved for military titans, a man who understood the nature of his enemy perfectly. He understood one crucial fact. The Persian advantage was their light, fast archers and their devastating cavalry. He needed to negate both by choosing the ground and timing the attack with absolute perfection, ensuring the battle would be decided by heavy infantry clash. He chose the battlefield with surgical precision, using the treacherous marshlands and dense trees on the flanks to neutralize the mighty Persian horsemen and force the horde into a constricted killing zone. Then came the stroke of genius that rewrote military doctrine for millennia and defined the potential of the citizen soldier, the intentional weakening of his center. Miltiades drew the overwhelming strength of the Persian infantry, the crack troops, the best of the king's levies, into a fatal trap. As the Persian center surged forward, celebrating their seemingly easy victory against the thin Greek line, the heavily armed Athenian wings, shielded by bronze and driven by existential fear, closed in with terrifying speed. It was a hammer and anvil maneuver executed by farmers, tradesmen, and poets who had suddenly become the most lethal infantry force on Earth, fighting for their homes and their radical new concept of self-governance. The heavy Greek phalanx, a solid wall of overlapping shields and bristling spear points, simply pulverized the lighter, less armored Persian foot soldiers. It wasn't a fight. It was a massacre of the most shocking kind, a slaughter fueled by desperation and discipline. The rout was absolute. The Persian commanders were caught completely off guard by this relentless, disciplined savagery, never having encountered such unified, fierce resistance in their endless campaigns across Asia. The legend of Pheidippides, the runner who carried the news of victory 26 miles back to Athens before collapsing dead upon uttering the single word, "Nenekakemen," we have won, perfectly encapsulates the sheer, exhausting desperation of that day. Athens was saved, the invasion force was repelled, and the mighty Darius was handed the first truly catastrophic defeat in the history of his otherwise flawless empire.